Did you, as part of your cooperation, what did you do? Made recorded phone calls and got information about what was going on in the neighborhood at the time? Did you provide information about a number of different people? Yes. And did you testify against some of those individuals as part of your cooperation in 2003? Yes. There were multiple people you testified against? Yes. And what sentence did you ultimately receive? 24 months. Did you also receive a term of supervised release? Yes. And how long was that? 8 years. And what is supervised release? Like probation. So there are certain rules you have to follow? Yes. And you were on this type of probation for about 8 years, you said? Yes. Following your release from the 2003 conviction, while you were on supervised release, were you arrested again for another drug offense? Yes. And was that your second federal arrest? Yes. And were you convicted for this second offense? Yes. Was that about 2013? Yes. And what was that offense? What was the offense you were convicted for? Distribution of heroin. And where were you distributing heroin? On Maple and Kilpatrick. Were you sentenced in that case? Yes. What sentence did you receive? 96 months. And was that was a prison term of 96 months? Yes. And because you were on supervised release for your prior conviction, did you receive an additional sentence? Yes. And what was that additional sentence? 28 months. And did you have to serve both the 96 months followed by the 28 months? Yes. So did you ultimately receive a sentence of about 124 months? Yes. So a little over 10 years? Yes. And did you serve that full 124 months? No. Why not? Because I got writted back for this situation. I'm sorry? I got writted back. You got writ back? Yes. So you were in custody and brought back to the federal building? Yes. And why were you brought back to the federal building? Because of my dealings with Mr. Spann. I'm sorry, sir. Could you repeat that? Because of my dealings with Mr. Spann. Because of your dealings with Mr. Spann? Yes. And did you testify in the grand jury about your dealings with Mr. Spann? Yes. And was that in about March of 2019? Yes. And what generally, without going into the specifics, did you testify in the grand jury about? About narcotic sales, extortion acts, and general things that we have done. And the information you provided in the grand jury cover a large time period? Yes. From when to when? From 02 till up to 13. 02 to about 2013, you said? Yes. And after you testified in the grand jury, did the government make a Rule 35 motion on your behalf? Yes. And what did you understand that to mean? That they would ask for a reduced sentence for my testimony? And did the judge give you a reduced sentence? Yes. And so you were originally supposed to leave federal prison in about June of 2020? Yes. And when did you actually leave federal prison? That date wrong, you said, ma'am. I'm sorry? That date wrong that you said. Sure. When were you actually supposed to leave federal prison? 21. November of 21. November of 21 was when you were supposed to actually leave? Yeah. And when did you actually leave? January of 20. So January of 2020 was when you were released from federal prison? Yes. And that was because you received a reduced sentence after the government made a motion? Yes. And, sir, so did you receive a reduction of about 21 months off your 124-month sentence? Yes. Sir, you're currently not in custody today, correct? No. And you have served all of your prison sentence? Yes. Are you currently on supervised release? Yes. And that's the probation that you had mentioned earlier? Yes. And has the government offered you anything or made you any promise as to your supervised release currently? No. Sir, turning to your testimony today, have you been granted immunity in exchange for your testimony today? Yes. And what do you understand that to mean? That I need to tell the truth. And do you understand that as long as you tell the truth, the testimony you give here today can't be used to incriminate you in any other proceedings? Yes. Do you understand that there are limits to the grant of immunity? Yes. And what do you understand those limits to be? That if you get caught being not truthful, you could be held responsible for that. And how would you be held responsible for that? By being incarcerated. Sir, I'd like to turn back to your membership in the Unknowns. And is the Unknowns the unknown vice lords? Yes. Is it fine for me to call them the Unknowns? Yes. As an unknown, did you interact with other members of the gang? Other members of other gangs? Yes. And did you have the opportunity to interact with members of other gangs more so because of your role as a 5-star universal? Yes. And why is that? Because you end up dealing with other people that are on the same level as you. What other gangs did you interact with as a 5-star universal? The Four Corner Hustlers, the Mafias, the Undertakers, the GDs, different people. What are the GDs? What does that stand for? The Gangster Disciples. You said the Undertaker Vice Lords? Yes. Are they another faction of the Vice Lords? Yes. What about the Four Corner Hustlers? Are they a faction of the Vice Lords? Yes. And what generally were some of your interactions with members from these other gangs? We would sell each other narcotics. We would swap guns. We would do different things that we did in the neighborhood. So you said you would sell narcotics? Yes. To each other? Yes. Would you supply narcotics to members of other gangs? Yes. And then you said you would also, trade guns? Yes. Did you personally interact with other members of the Four Corner Hustlers in the late 1990s as a chief of the Unknowns? Yes. In that same time period, did you know there to be separate sets or factions of the Four Corner Hustlers on the West Side? Yes. What separate factions did you know of on the West Side of the Four Corner Hustlers? There's multiples of them, but back then it was the Gordy Boys, it was the Brickyards, it was the Pulaski Road. You said the Gordy Boys, the Brickyards, and the Pulaski Road? Uh-huh. Were there any other factions along Pulaski of the Four Corner Hustlers? Not back then when you said. Did the Gordy Boys have a leader? Yes. And when you were interacting with the Four Corner Hustlers in the late 1990s, who was the leader? It was Lil Charles at the time. Lil Charles? Yes. And did you know Lil Charles to control a specific territory on the West Side? Yes. Where was that? From Harrison to the viaduct is Tallman. I mean, you said the viaduct? Yes. Is that about Taylor or Fillmore? Yes. And those are the north-south boundaries? Yes. What are what east-west boundaries? From Springfield to Costner? So you knew Little Charles to control as the leader of the Gordy Boys from Harrison to either Taylor or Fillmore and Springfield to Costner? Yes. And did you know other Four Corner Hustlers from that area? Yes. And who did you know? Brother Man, LeVar, Spiffy, Momo, Anthem Man, Jesse. I know multiple members, ma'am. And sir, you mentioned a person named Broman. Yes. Did you know Broman's real name? Yes. What was his real name? LeVar Span. And do you see someone by that name here in the courtroom today? Yes. Could you please point him out by where he's sitting in the courtroom and something he's wearing? He's on the right side of the courtroom with a blanket on, with a mask on. Your Honor, I'd ask the record reflect the court identification of the defendant. It will. Thank you. Your Honor, may I have a moment? Yes.